Well, the first thing I want to say is just thank you all for being here. I know I've spoken to each and every one of you and interviewed you, and you do a wonderful job in your communities. And the reason we wanted to do this is because when we did our check-in with the chief segment here on Channel 7, each police chief that I spoke to individually said domestic violence was either the #1 crime in their community or right up there at the top. Can you just speak on that for your individual communities? What is domestic violence like in your community?
Well, Carolyn, that's a problem in my community, but to your point, it transcends all communities, right? And so all classes, all socioeconomic positions, and so it's a problem across the country. But in our community, yes, it's definitely an issue. We have roughly 300 incidents of domestic violence a year, and it's remained fairly steady for a long time.
For a long time.
Yeah, and the same. We average over 1,200 calls for service for domestic violence alone annually. And it equates to about 25 runs per week. And when you look at the statistics, they're alarming because a lot of the arrests involve incidents where violence has transpired, where the abuser, who's in the process of trying to gain control over the victim, uses threats and violence and verbal abuse as well to maintain that control.
Chief Haines.
In the city of Eastpointe is much the same as the other two agencies here. Since the beginning of this year, since January, we've already had assault incidents of almost 900, of which about 90% of those were domestic violence type incidents where people were either harmed or other things that happened at the residence that caused us to have to be there and to assist them.
Can you pinpoint anything as to why in 2024 domestic violence is still such a big issue in communities and getting worse?
That's a tough question. I can tell you that it really, for me, it revolves a lot around control. And so, unfortunately, this is something that's been going on for many, many years. But to your point, there's been so much education around it, and it's fairly disappointing to see that there hasn't been some improvement across the country when it comes to domestic violence.
Well, I think learned behavior is part of it. You know, watching domestic violence transpire in the home. You know, when you look at the definition of domestic violence in the first place, is violence or aggressive behavior occurring inside of a home. And so in that setting, you have the siblings, the children watching this behavior. And unfortunately, is repeated over time. And so it's important that we continue to bring awareness to domestic violence for that very reason, because there are resources available.
I would agree with both of those answers. And also, I mean, domestic violence is generally, not always, but generally committed inside the home, which is a very private place. The police aren't there aren't other people watching. And these children that are witnessing this, they go on to sometimes become perpetrators of the same crimes later in life because it is learned behavior. One of the things that we've done in Eastpointe, which we started at the beginning of the school year, was to get our school resource officer into the schools to not only help alleviate issues at the school, but also to have someone that the children can talk to and maybe root out some of the problems of domestic violence.
Is that key? Because when I think about it, as many times as I've spoken out at domestic violence events or at homeless shelters and that sort of thing, I always feel like we should be teaching young kids early about violence and how to refrain from it. Is that an answer?
Yeah, I think that's helpful, but to Elvin's point, I mean, the cycle continues, and right, so the idea that a young man or a young boy is raised in a home where he's witnessing domestic violence, he's 10 times more likely to become an abuser himself, and so that cycle does continue. So how do you break that cycle is really the question. So I think getting education in early is a component of that, obviously.
Yeah, and when we started our domestic violence committee, one of the first things we understood was important to bring the schools in. And so we have representatives of the schools who participate. And when we do our annual domestic violence walk, and Southfield, proud to announce our 5th year, and it continues to grow, we brought the children as part of the equation, where we had the middle school band out, you know, having that youth representation so they understand the importance of it, so they can hear some of the survivors of domestic violence tell their stories, and they can see just how serious this topic is.
It normally takes a woman 7 times, right? 7 times going back and forth, and maybe by the 7th or 8th time, she might break that cycle. Do you find that?
I don't know about the exact number, but it is several times. And a lot of this is because, you know, they feel that they're in love. This isn't going to happen again. You know, he's apologized. There's that control. There's, you know, he's the breadwinner of the family. And what am I going to do if he's locked in jail? You know, the same thing could be said with men. if the role is reversed.
So tell me this, because it's such a big deal, I want to ask you each specifically, what are you doing within your department? What specific measures are you putting in place to prevent domestic violence before it begins, or community outreach? I know you've done walks. This is your 5th one, but.
So we do a great deal of community outreach. I think one of the things that's really important too is we train our police officers to recognize domestic violence and how to investigate that crime. You know, you very often hear, well, why doesn't she just leave? And I think the chief from Eastpointe, he touched on that, right? There's so many emotions involved. She's leaving potentially violence, but what is she heading towards? Homelessness, not being able to put food on the table. She's leaving someone that she loves, right? She's also, like we outlined previously, the moment that you can tell someone that you're no longer going to be with them, you're much greater danger, because you're losing control. And so it's a very dangerous time. So we train our police officers to understand and recognize the dynamics, to put themselves in the victim's shoes. We work with a victim's advocate, and we have victims advocates that are in-house in our police department to be able to help transition or help victims through the criminal justice system. We also look for opportunities to prosecute offenders sometimes when the victim is unwilling to. There's provisions within the law to do that, because there are times where it is appropriate to still try to press charges even though the victim doesn't want to cooperate.
Police officers are in grave danger too when they go on domestic violence runs, right? What have you seen there?
I've seen, just over my career, several situations where our officers have went in and started their investigation of domestic violence, and whether they've determined it was the female that started, or it was the aggressor, or whether it was the male that was the aggressor, the opposite spouse will join in on assaulting the police officers when the officers go to place the person under arrest, and they've gotten seriously injured that way. So there is a lot of danger, and you know, again, you're going into somebody's private home. You don't know what you're walking into, and you don't know what weapons they may have access to or anything else when you're going in there.
So do you all train for that? Train your officers, especially when it's a domestic violence run?
Absolutely.
Yes, it's part of our equation. You know, this is my 2nd police department. Spent 21 years with the Detroit Police Department. And while managing many barricaded gun person situations, a lot of those evolved from domestic violence disputes, where the woman, for example, was held hostage, and the SWAT team is called upon to negotiate a peaceful resolution. In most cases, we've been very successful in that, but there have been other cases where either suicide or homicides take place. And that's why it's important for our police officers to understand, when you respond to a domestic violence call for service, it is one of the most dangerous calls for service, because that aggression, that emotion will be transferred to the police officers.
Wow. So you were.
Like 20% of the time, the victims of domestic violence homicide are not the intended or the victim itself or the spouse. It's the family members, it's the children, or it's a police officer.
So for each of you, what's the word? What haunts you when you think about domestic violence cases that you've seen in your community? What's the one that stands out and still haunts you to this day?
Well, I'll start off with the most recent one just here in Southfield, because it impacted so many different people, particularly children. We had a situation where a woman was terminating the relationship. She moved on to a new relationship. Her and her new friend had got a room in a hotel in Southfield. Little did she know, her ex had tracked her using some technology. And when she comes out of the hotel with her new boyfriend, they're both gunned down. She's gunned down fatally, and he's placed in a critical situation, still battling from his scars. And what happened was the Southfield Police Department, in coordination with other police departments, we now have to track him down. And we went through 3 different cities, ultimately found him in the city of Detroit. But here's what the compelling thing, and I mentioned about how children are involved. Before he had an interaction with the Southfield police officers, he got a hold of his children and pretty much gave them his last goodbyes. Because when he came in contact with the Southfield police officers, he pulled out a weapon, which I believe was suicide by cop, knowing what he had just done to his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend.
Which is why he said goodbye to his children.
Absolutely.
Do you remember a case, Chief Haines?
I do, and it's strange, because I've been in law enforcement for almost 34 years. And one that really comes to mind is one shortly after I first got to the city of Eastpointe. And it's a little bit different because it wasn't a husband and wife or boyfriend girlfriend, but it was son mother. And that one is just, so tragic and just resonates with me because, we investigated this, and through the investigation we learned that the son, had beaten his mom to death. But not only that, I mean, he went to work cleaning up the house, and then stuffed her body in a drain culvert behind the house and the residence where they lived. And it was just so tragic. I mean, you know, one of those things when you're growing up, I mean, mom is mom, right? And for something to go so wrong in that relationship that we weren't aware of, or anybody was aware of, that nobody reported anything, and then to have it come to such a tragic end like that, it's just, that will probably be with me forever.
You know, Carolyn, I don't have a specific story. I can just tell you over 26 years I've seen a lot of trauma, and I've seen a lot of devastation in families, and I've seen a lot of scared individuals and children and women that have suffered under the hands of domestic violence.
Wow. Tell me this. What does your department do to hold perpetrators accountable, especially the ones that show up time and time again? You know, they've done it over and over again to either their wife, their girlfriend, somebody else in the community. How do you track them, or do you?
So we track the domestic violence across the city, but to your point, the criminal justice system is so much larger than just the police department. So we work hand in hand with our prosecutor's office. Kim Worthy does an excellent job to try to hold the offenders accountable. But really, there's so many dynamics that come to play, right, when you make an arrest for domestic violence. And so it's about getting a victim's advocate involved early, right, to help the victim through this process. Because as you can imagine, all of these emotions come to bear. Family gets involved. Sometimes you have women here that have no family, that are here from overseas. And so it's just being very supportive of victims through that process to make sure that we can get prosecutions and try to turn victims into survivors.
What we do is make sure that our response times are very quick in Southfield, particularly when it comes to domestic violence, because as we mentioned before, the emotion involved. The quicker we get there, the quicker we're able to either make the arrest or resolve the situation. Because it's important, because time is ticking. And what we've learned is that through working with Haven, which is a great partner in this fight on domestic violence, we've done training with them. We've updated our forms. I'll give you an example. We have a form that we fill out for all the victims of domestic violence to capture exactly what transpired. And one thing that we added to our form with the recommendation of Haven is, was the person's strength, particularly our women, because the data suggests that once it comes to a point where you're being strangled, homicide is in the near future. And this is a national study. And so those are the things what we have to continue to evolve with our policies, our procedures, our documents, and it will help through the court process once this information is outlined.
Wow, I never heard that. That's my first time hearing that. So what message are you sending to women, especially for men who are always, you know, putting their hand around your neck or trying to strangle you?
Yeah. So again, once an individual, your partner, begins to strangle you, again, this is national data. It is a step towards murder or homicide in the very near future.
There's certain indicators that could suggest that that person might be at higher risk of homicide or violence versus just, I hate to say it, but there's certain indicators that might suggest that a woman might be at a higher risk of violence than just run-of-the-mill domestic violence, if there is such a thing, for lack of a better word.
So what do you say to women who end up being fearful? Something happens, the police are called, and then they're afraid to go to court because they feel like the person who is beating on them will be locked up for a while and then get let out, and then they're going to come back. Like you know, the reason I say that, I remember seeing a case on CNN where a little boy was with his mom was pregnant, and I guess her abuser had been locked up. But as soon as he got out, he came there, and that little boy tried to protect his mom. The little boy ended up being killed, you know, trying to protect his mom, his pregnant mom.
That's certainly one of the most difficult things that we do. You know, what we do in Eastpointe is probably what the other officers do everywhere. I mean, we do our best to reassure them. We get them the services, whatever services we can possibly get for them. We make sure that they're aware that, you know, we're going to do extra checks on their house. We're going to keep, you know, the best watch we can. You know, we advise them to get personal protection orders and get conditional bond orders from the court. I mean, all those things are nice, but at the end of the day, it is one of the reasons why domestic violence doesn't get reported as much as it really occurs, because they are afraid. They don't know where to turn, and they know that, you know, on our best day, we're going to be a minute or so away, you know, from being able to be there to protect them and to keep them safe. So, again, it's one of the most difficult things we have to do, and try to convince them, you know, that this is, you're going to get better, you're going to heal from this, but what can we do to help you?
Let's talk about cultural barriers too, because it's different, you know, if you're in a white community, if you're in a Middle Eastern community, because I spoke to one woman who said she was so fearful, and then she finally did speak out, and she actually did an interview with me. But how do you deal with cultural barriers when you're dealing with victims in homes?
So I think it's important to have a police department that's a mirror reflection of the community we serve. And so you have a number of, we have a diverse police department that I'm proud of, that has improved its diversity over the last several years. So you start there. I think it's important to have victims advocates, right? And people that are familiar with the culture and the language and the community that they serve as well. So that type of understanding can help bring better results.
Yeah, there's a lot of communities who, through tradition, is what goes on in the house stays in the house.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that does not work for domestic violence. And so we encourage individuals, and I know it's very difficult, but to have the courage to seek help. There are resources that are available. Haven does a tremendous job here in Oakland County with having shelters. And the shelters are not only just for the victims, but also the children can also be housed for a time period in those shelters. So take advantage of the resources. I do have confidence in our court process as well through Oakland County, our prosecutor. Accountability is happening, but how do we sustain it? And we need individuals to come forward and seek that help.
And we also have a chaplain corps that we have in Eastpointe, and it's amazing because every one of the chaplains is a pastor at one of the local churches in the city of Eastpointe. So we do have that outreach as well, and we have them available for women or men or whoever needs to talk and to get some reassurances. But it's another connection with our community as well, because a lot of the people that we serve, I mean, they go to these churches and they are confident in the pastor that they have, and so that's been very helpful to us in Eastpointe.
Is there something that I'm missing? Are there long-term strategies that you're working on to deal with this? I mean, do you talk about it? Talk about long-term strategies? Is there something we can do as journalists to help?
I think what you're doing right here is a step in the right direction. It's about bringing awareness. It's about making domestic violence everyone's business, right? Not allowing it to happen behind closed doors, breaking the stigma. So this type of interaction, this broadcast, I think helps. But you're right, there's still so much work to be done.
You know, although October is a National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, this type of segment, as my partner already described, is huge because this is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week event that's happening throughout all cultures. And so we applaud you and the station for bringing this much-needed topic to the forefront.
I agree with both of my colleagues, and I think the term that I was thinking is exposure. These things need to be exposed, and they need to be brought out in the open so that we have these discussions. And you bringing this out like this is amazing because it gives us a chance to talk about what we see on an everyday basis and what our officers see. But it opens up the entire picture so that everybody can see what's going on out there, and they can be our eyes and ears for our communities as well.
This is going to air in December. Does it get worse around the holidays, around Thanksgiving, around Christmas?
I honestly think it does. And I don't know if it's just conjecture, but when families are together, when they're not at work, when they're not as busy, we see that there's more conflict in the home, unfortunately. Would you agree with that?
Oh,
Yeah.
every year we plan for that, knowing that entering into the holiday season is a issue with domestic violence and inter-family feuds. And so whether there's conflicts during the dinner time or when families come together, for some reason it happens at higher numbers during the holiday season.
More drinking.
Right.
Yeah.
In addition to that, suicides go
Yeah,
up.
I was gonna say
And there's a correlation between some of the domestic violence issues and then, as I described earlier, murder-suicides, all involving domestic violence. So we have to be aware, we have to be paying attention because this is a time of year of much concern.
Wow. Is there anything that if a family is listening to this, and this is going to air in mid-December, I think, but if a family is listening to this and you know you have these issues, brewing in your family, do you have a message for them? Is there a word of caution? What can you do?
My advice would be reach out. It doesn't have to be 911. You could call a crisis line, 988. You could call a victim's advocate. If you're not in immediate danger and you're more comfortable reaching out to someone that's other than law enforcement, I encourage you to. we're here for you. I can speak for Elvin and Corey. Our police departments are here to keep our communities safe. We've trained our officers, and we're here to help you when you need it. But please reach out. Don't suffer in silence.
Tell someone.
Yeah.
We would prefer an advocate or law enforcement, but tell someone. Let someone in your life know what you're going through. That's an opportunity for you to vent. It's an opportunity for the person that you love to help you seek the resources. It may give you the courage to seek those resources. But please tell someone what you're going through.
Yes, I agree with my colleagues. Speak up. Tell somebody what you're going through. Like they said, even if it's not law enforcement, even if it's an advocate, even if it's your pastor, let somebody know what you're going through so that they can either help you or get you to the services that you need. Especially coming into the holidays. I mean, this is a big time where, some things happen where people don't have enough money, so they feel less, they're not getting enough presents, or they're not being, able to provide for their family like they will, and the arguments start. So just get help, talk to somebody.
I want to ask you all one other thing, and then I'm going to give you the floor. You can have your final word, or if you think I'm missing anything that I really need to include, please tell me. But there are people we deal with, I'm not going to say who, but even our colleagues here at Channel 7, and the one thing I heard is that, men will call now too, and almost try and get the upper hand on a woman and report that she's beating on me, although someone has been beating on her for years and years. And then when it lands in the court, it's like they have the upper hand, or they can destroy you financially. What do women do when they're in that situation and they're very, very fearful because their life is being destroyed, money is being taken away, but now, the tables have been reversed on them. And so now their partner or husband is in court saying, no, she's the abuser. She abused me first.
Gosh, it's a tough one. I mean, the reality is that it's all about control, domestic violence. And so it's just another kind of look at control, right? And being able to try to write the script for themselves. That's a tough one. You can't put cameras in your house, right? You can't recording each other. If you're living in that kind of space, I would just encourage you to try to find help and get away from it, because it's not going to get any better.
Yeah, these abusers are very good at manipulating.
Yeah.
And that's where they'll flip the script, if you will, and make themselves seem like the victim. And so when police officers arrive at a scene, oftentimes we're able to look around and try to determine if there's a possibility that some of this action has been captured on video. And we've been successful at retrieving some of that video through Ring doorbell cameras, or sometimes a child or the victim themselves recorded on their phones. So it can help through the court process when that manipulator tries to flip the script and make themselves the victim. And so these are just some of the ideas. Recording is probably the best avenue of getting the information through the court system to tell your side of the story through video evidence.
And I would say also, and I don't want this to sound strange, but be honest when the police are there. As honest as you can be about everything that's happened. Don't try to cover it up. Don't try to minimize, because that can throw off our investigation as well. And when we're there, we do the best we can. Our officers are well trained. They separate the parties so that they're not talking in front of each other, to the best of our abilities. But again, you have to tell us what's going on so that we can see, and then the officers can indicate in the report, different information, and they can see the prosecutor. We have a great prosecutor in Pete Lucido. I mean, he treats domestic violence very seriously, but he needs the information in order to proceed. And if you get all that information to us the best you can, and when the investigators are looking at it, by the time the prosecutor looks at it, by the time it gets to court, we have a pretty good idea who really had the upper hand in that situation.
So I'm going to give you all the final word, but I also want to say, is there a message to families out here, meaning, children are not born abusers. They learn by seeing, they learn by hearing, and then they end up doing. Do you have a message for families? I know families want to keep, bad things hidden in their homes, but, if you train up a child, to be kind and to treat others with kindness instead of violence, wouldn't that make a difference?
It would, Carolyn, but if you're living in a home where you're seeing domestic violence on the regular, and that's your kind of the context that you're growing up in. The data would suggest that young men grow up and have a greater propensity to be violent themselves and turn into domestic abusers. And then a young lady oftentimes finds themselves either the victim of physical abuse or even sexual abuse. And so while you can train up and you can do those things, really the key is to just try to get out of that situation. And I know how difficult it is, but I'm praying for those victims, and I want them to understand that we're here for you.
You know, when you look at domestic violence, one thing that is concerning is the number of victims who refuse to prosecute. And we kind of touched on it here, so many different reasons why that is. But we have to continue to encourage them to prosecute, because the cycle of behavior, it continues. Many times individuals give their abuser a second chance, a third chance, and then ultimately it ends up in a homicide. So that's the message I want to make very clear to anyone watching who's going through this. It may end up very tragic if you stay in a situation where you're constantly being abused, particularly physically abused, who will only get worse.
Yes, and I agree with both of my colleagues here. I think we can, change the effect on our children by training them and raising them the right way. But again, if it's learned behavior, if it's what they're seeing day in and day out, it doesn't matter how much we preach to them, you shouldn't do this or this shouldn't be that way. They're going to be the same way. They've learned that behavior through what they've watched, their entire lives growing up. So I think it's very important. Again, everything starts in the home. And the parents have to make sure that, if they're in a domestic violence situation like that, one of them needs to get out. I mean, that's the biggest thing, is to get to safety and leave that situation so that your children aren't growing up in that. And sometimes that can be a stigma as well, that you don't want to grow up in a single parent home, but it's much safer and it's much better for the children than to stay in a situation that's involving domestic violence.
Am I missing anything, or any final words that you all want to say?
Also, through your most closest friends, have a password. You may be involved in a domestic violence situation, violence is transpiring, you don't have a whole lot of time to talk on the phone. You may be able to text or a brief conversation, whatever that password is, so that your loved one knows to call 911 or bring help to get you out of that situation.
Well, that's a good one.
The one thing I'd like to add is I would implore our legislators to fund shelters, to fund all of these victims advocates groups. I mean, it's important that when a woman wants to leave a violent situation, that there's a clean, safe, healthy place for her to go. So there needs to be some more funding and advocacy on that end as well.
Right, and I would just say, again, speak up and speak out. Let someone know what you're going through so that that information can get relayed to us. We're, in Eastpointe, we're always here for our citizens. We're going to be here. We're going to do our best to patrol the city and do our best to respond to runs when we need them, but you really need to speak up and let us know what's going on.
Thank you for this, Carolyn. Good job.
Yes, thank
No,
you.
thank you all for showing up and, and being here and being here for your communities too. You know what I mean? And, yeah. Did we miss anything?
I think we're good. One thing I was gonna say, what if the police if a female is at home and she sees something escalating, and, and with her husband, just say, or her partner, what should they do if they call you? Should they, leave the house? Should they stay in the situation? Should they wait till you get there? You know what I mean? Like, front line, what should they do? Or should they meet you at the door? Those kind of things to make them, to avoid a problem. As you see it escalating, I mean, these women and men know it is escalating. They know what's coming next.
I think it's important, if you're calling 911, to paint a very clear picture for the dispatcher, right? Are there weapons in the home? What's the context of the argument? Has he been drinking? So just be a very good witness at that point. Obviously, leaving the home under, I think, most circumstances would make the most sense.
Yes.
So that'd be my 2 cents.
I mean, and have a neighbor's house that you can go to. Have someone that that you can go to their house, make sure that the police know where you're going to be, so that you just don't leave the house and the police get there and aren't able to find you or locate you. But certainly, I mean, my message would be to get out of the situation as quickly as you can, and especially if you've already called us. I mean, we will be on the way, but your safety is paramount, and staying in that situation until we get there is not always the best choice.
Yeah, each situation is different. There may be times where you're not able to get out of the house.
Right.
But but times when you can safely get out of that home, take advantage of that. But be somewhere where we can locate you, make sure we get you the medical aid you may need, the research you may need, because we want to follow through to make sure accountability takes place.
Beautiful.
Chief, if I can, if you want to comment that our dispatchers are also trained, so if a victim isn't able to speak clear language, that the dispatchers can get, and for yes or no questions, where the victim, you know, can pretend they're ordering
like-
pizza type thing.
Like most dispatchers are intuitive enough and have been trained to recognize when there might be somebody who's in the background that is threatening you. So our dispatchers are trained to elicit information in ways that would be covertly, so that the person in the background doesn't know you're calling them.
You know, that's really important because, you know, we had a story on the news where a woman was about to be raped in a field, and somehow she made it seem like she was ordering pizza or something, and right? And a dispatcher sent officers and, you know, stopped her from being raped in a field. I don't know how she did that, but it was pretty,
Yeah, I saw that story.
right?
Yeah. Also, text 911 is available in pretty much all jurisdictions in Michigan. So text 911. They also translate if you have different language barriers, but text 911 is available.
Or simply calling 911 and just leaving the line open.
Yes.
Right, and letting us capture what's happening, and we'll be able to grasp the circumstances and respond as well.
That's a
Yes.
good one. Just dial 911, put the phone down,
Put it down.
and then they can track.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you.